Brought to you by Penguin.
Selling Hitler by Robert Harris. Read by David Rintoul. Acknowledgements. This account is based upon interviews with the main participants in the Hitler Diaries affair, upon the many hundreds of pages of prosecution evidence generated by the subsequent trial, and upon the so-called Stern report, the findings of the internal commission set up by Stern to examine how the fiasco occurred. Almost all of this information came to me on the understanding that its various sources would not be identified publicly. It would be invidious to try to single out the few who did speak freely. I hope I shall be forgiven if I thank them here collectively rather than individually. My editor at the BBC, David Dickinson, was once again extremely understanding. My colleague Jane Ellison collaborated on the research from the first interview to the last document. Without her help, this book could not have been written. Robert Harris, September 1985. Note: most of the financial transactions concerning the Hitler Diaries were conducted in Deutschmarks. In April 1983, when the diaries were published, the rates of exchange were £1 equals 3.76 marks, $1 equals 2.44 marks. Prologue. On April Fool's Day, 1983, the distinguished British historian Hugh Redwood Trevor Roper, 1st Baron Dacre of Glanton, was telephoned at his country home in Scotland by the assistant editor of the Times, Mr. Colin Webb. Among his many honours, Trevor Roper had, in 1974, accepted an invitation to become an independent national director of Times newspapers. For 9 years, his telephone had rung periodically with news of strikes, sackings, and closures. But this call had nothing to do with routine Times business. It concerned a discovery of great historical significance. It was strictly confidential. The German magazine Stern, said Mr. Webb, had discovered the private diaries of Adolf Hitler. Trevor Roper, a former Regius Professor of History at Oxford, was startled and immediately sceptical. I said to myself, there are so many forgeries circulating in the grey market, forged documents about Bormann, forged diaries of Eva Braun, falsified accounts of interviews with Hitler. Besides, it was well known that Hitler disliked putting pen to paper and had virtually given up writing in his own hand altogether after 1933. As far as he was aware, there was no evidence, either in the German archives or in the recollections of Hitler's subordinates, to suggest that the German dictator had kept a diary. If he had, and if it had now been discovered, it would certainly rank as one of the greatest historical finds of modern times. Hitler, as Trevor Roper himself had written, was the 20th century's Genghis Khan, the political genius whose murderous influence upon mankind was still being felt 4 decades after his death. If this diabolical figure, contrary to all accepted beliefs, turned out to have kept a diary, it would provoke a sensation. Webb explained that Stern was offering to sell the foreign serial rights in the diaries. Rupert Murdoch, the owner of Times newspapers, was considering bidding not merely for the British and Commonwealth, but possibly for the American rights as well. The syndication negotiations were about to begin. In the meantime, the diaries themselves were being kept in a bank vault in Switzerland. Webb said that Murdoch wanted an expert's opinion before making an offer for the diaries. Would Trevor Roper, as an authority on the period and a director of the company, be willing to act as an advisor? Would he fly out to Zurich and examine the material? Trevor Roper said he would. In that case, said Webb, Stern would expect him in Switzerland at the end of the following week. By the time Adolf Hitler had passed his 52nd birthday, there was no longer a human being left in history who could provide a precedent for his impact on the earth. In January 1942, whilst he picked at his customary vegetarian supper at his headquarters in East Prussia, his soldiers were guarding U-boat pens on the Atlantic coast, shivering in dugouts on the approach roads to Moscow, sweating in tanks in the Libyan desert. In less than 20 years, he had passed from brawling provincial politician
Sample complete. Ready to continue?